Hi, folks. I am Irisanya Moon, author of Pantheon, the Greeks, and I get to talk to you about it today. A little bit about me, in case you don't know. Irisanya Moon, I am an author, witch, priestess, teacher. Current hyperfixations are Greek mythology, which is really helpful. So I wrote this book, Pantheon the Greeks, and I would love to share a little bit of it with you today. I would also love to, talk through why I think a book like this is really helpful for folks who are interested in the Greeks and interested in the magic surrounding the Greeks. So let's get into it. So, first of all, for folks who don't know, a pantheon is actually a word from Greek, and it is a group of the most important things of an organization or of a system. And that, so pan, all of, is another way to look at it. And theon comes from theos for gods. And so this is the most important gods of the group. But Pantheon is actually a little bit bigger than that. So I want to just say that because this book that I wrote and other Pantheon books that other Moon Books authors have written are not just about the gods. It's about the system of beliefs and the system of practices, as much as you can fit into a book without it being 2,000 pages. And what is really important about this for folks who are just even the littlest bit interested is that when you learn about the Greek gods, like I have in piecemeal because I went to a Christian school, so we didn't have Greek mythology, when you learn about them individually, that's really great. But when you learn about where they come from, what the history is, what the sort of creation stories are, and the family trees, that actually helps create some more context for the gods that you might work with. So, for example, I worked with Aphrodite for a very long time. And once I learned more about the rest of the family, so to speak, I kind of understood why she acted in the way that she did and how she shows up for me and my personal practices. Definitely inform that. And at any time during this, if folks are watching live, please feel free to leave a question and I will try my best to answer it. And if you're watching this later, please feel free to send me questions, reach out to me. I'd love to answer anything that might pop up for you. But so, knowing this and knowing that a pantheon is really helpful to understand the complexities and the interconnections of all the folks in ancient Greece, I just want to go through sort of the outline of this book and give you a little insight into each of the sections so that you can see what might be really interesting and what definitely I found interesting. And right at the end, I'll read a little portion of the book so that you can get a little taste of what you're in for when you get this. So this is a bigger book than any of the books that I've written so far. And for obvious reasons, ancient Greece and its mythologies, it's a big topic. And I didn't cover every single thing because that would be enormous. And I focused on the folks that I thought were most important, while also bringing in folks who are sometimes left to the side, because that's kind of what I do in the Greek books that I've written. Sort of bring forward the folks that don't get enough attention. I see you, Iris. But in this book, I will start with, of course, my normal notes and introduction and why I'm so excited about this. I think that if you followed me at any point, you know that I am. But there are two parts to this book. And so the first part is sort of the background knowledge. Now, I want to begin by reminding folks that ancient Greece, like any group, is not a monolith. And so we can't say that every ancient Greek practice looked like this, everybody believed this. We just can't do that. I do use the phrase ancient Greece because it's what folks recognize, but I want to leave that caveat in there. In the first part of the book, chapter 1 is about history. So we're setting the scene in Greece of that time, what the land was like, what the culture was like. We're also talking about the timeline in which all of these gods and all these writings about the gods arrived, or at least what is assumed to be those timelines. So you'll get a really clear picture of what that looks like and where to sort of place some of these stories. because a lot of these stories are based on events and or they are explanations of events that happened during these times, and so that people would understand what was important and understand how to act or how based on what the gods did or didn't do. Also in this book there's a little map of ancient Greece, so you sort of get an idea of what the area looked like and what kind of land we're looking at. And, special shout out to myself, I created this map. So if it's wildly off, hopefully no one's using it for sailing. But it does create a little bit of a more personal approach, like a personal connection to it, when you can see where things happen, when you can understand that Athens is here, but Olympus is up there. That's helpful in sort of building these stories and the connections with gods in your head. Because, when I talk to other people and want to build relationships with them, I definitely want them to know where I come from. And so, because it says some things. In the history section, I also want to make sure, I wanted to make sure at least, that we just touched very briefly on the different cultural norms of a reader today and a person living in ancient Greece. There is a lot of assault in Greek mythology and the myths. There is a lot. And so I address that and talk about what current scholars are talking about in terms of what that meant for that time versus what it meant for this day. So if you're ever curious about that, I have lots of resources and a lot of things to say about that, but I'll leave that to you for reading. Chapter 2 is the mythology, so not necessarily the myths, but sort of talking about mythology. And for me, that means discussing very clearly where the myths come from. So I'm talking about primary and secondary texts. I'm talking about why those texts are important, what came out of them, so that you get a sense of where the sources are for the information that I have. And I know for sure I haven't looked at every single text that has any sort of reference to ancient Greece. However, this will also give you a reading list if you want to get all hyperfixated like I have. And you can find out more about linear A and B and various papyri and the Greek magical papyri, etc. Because a lot of times we get these stories out of children's books and word of mouth, the internet, and how people have summarized them, but these actually come from source texts. And so it's very helpful to learn about mythology from those places whenever possible. Now, of course, just like the myths have been translated by different folks with different viewpoints, you will probably see stories and think about them in terms of what you know and what you understand. So obviously, stories will change, sort of like that telephone game. I don't know if anybody's played that as a kid, but you whisper something to somebody and then they whisper it to someone else. And then by the time it gets all the way around the circle, it's a completely different story. Something to keep in mind. I also have a section in that mythology chapter about women-led translations, because often the ones that we see are not women-led. So that's a place. There's a lot of translations. I didn't even know this until I looked it up, that there are a lot more than I had thought. So good to know. Chapter 3 is cosmology and cosmogony. So to use a simpler word, creation story. So thinking about where the myths kind of originate and how folks of that time saw the world. So in terms of what they saw in the sky, what they saw happening around them, and how they took that information and then explained it in order to inform the myths. So I talk all about the story of creation. Now there are several in the Greek mythology. However, I do bring forward the ones that are probably the most recognized. So kind of going from Gaia until the Olympians, there's a lot more that goes in between. But those are the ones I tend to focus on. And as we move through this book, you'll see that I don't skip over other gods, though. They're very important. Other things that are in this particular section is also the landscape. So that is how the worlds are set up, sort of the Olympus and, up at the top, and how there is Tartarus, and how there's also the underworld, which is not Tartarus. And there's also the land of, humans. And so bringing those forward a bit, there's a little graphic in there too. Also talking about how to get to the underworld, how to move through different places, what happens after death. There's a lot in here. And so I highly recommend you look at that to sort of orient yourself, because I think a lot of movies and stories are giving the right impression of what's going on in ancient Greece and its mythology. However, there's a little bit more that's actually really interesting. Now, chapter 4 is religion and ritual. So, this is, of course, one of my favorite chapters because this is where my hyperfixation really comes alive. And I start off that section actually with a quote that I'd love to read. And it goes like, there was another side to Greek religion. They knew that gods abounded everywhere. These powers could be friendly, but they could equally well be indifferent or positively hostile. You had to be careful. To avoid arousing a god's opposition was as important as winning his support. This helps to explain why religion played such a large part in Greek life. Prayers, sacrifices, omens, oracles, festivals, buildings, all were reminders of the gods. This religion was more concerned with ritual than morals, which speaks to an earlier thing that I mentioned that's in chapter 1. So in this section, it is talking about the different practices to religion and ritual and how that shows up. Because I think, of most folks who are reading this are often interested in building relationships with gods or working magic or working with the different spells and things like that we find in books, curse tablets, all that fun stuff. So some of the main practices, the sort of things that point to religion and ritual in ancient Greece and in this pantheon are offerings. I talk about oaths. I talk about different rites, the death rites and marriage as being the two biggest ones. But also I talk about mystery cults. Let me grab my water real quick. Mystery cult, so that is sort of the recreation of Demeter and Persephone, and also other mystery cults like Dionysian. I also talk about oracles, so I think about the oracle at Delphi, not the only one. Also talk about temples, which in some cases a pantheon is a temple in ancient Greece, so that's something you might see. I also talk about the Olympic Games because that was actually a celebration of the gods and the gods got to show off. And also talking about the personal practices. So those are the things that are happening in every day. And those are things that are happening in the household. And while there are definitely practices that are bigger and more focused on the cities, we think of Athens, we think of Athena. But there are also things that folks did on their own, in their own families. And I talk about it a little bit more further on in the book, but it's something to remember that citizens had their own personal practices. And there was also an expectation that the eldest son of a family would be sort of like the high priest of the family and would be the one to sort of figure out how to perform rituals and how to support the welfare and the prosperity of their families. Chapter 5 is more about celebrations and festivals. So this is very complicated in ancient Greece. There are many, many celebrations and festivals, and it is complicated and it looks really complicated. However, if you look to see why they celebrated each of these festivals, and there's one in most months, and the months are named differently in ancient Greece, so I talk about that. Each of these months has a celebration to a god that is, the celebration is meant to not only revere them and honor them and definitely spotlight them, but also to ask for their help, because usually it's at a time of year where that particular god would be super helpful. So, having a celebration to Poseidon, the god of the sea, is very helpful when all of the ships are going off to do their trading or their exploration. You wanted the seas to be calm. You wanted them to be not too calm, but you wanted them to not be dangerous. So, you would make offerings and you'd celebrate Poseidon because that was the time of year when things could get a little crunchy. And so, if you made the right offerings, maybe that wouldn't be the case. There were celebrations to, I only list some of them because obviously there's many. It depends on the location. Not everything was in Athens. There's a whole peninsula and there's also islands. But the ones that I talk about are sort of the bigger ones that most folks have either heard of or might expect. So those are celebrations for Apollo, for Zeus, for Poseidon, Dionysus, Artemis, Athena, Aphrodite, etc. In that section too, I do talk about the complexity of who could attend these celebrations and who couldn't. And that again brings forward cultural norms of the time. It also allows a modern reader to see that sometimes our instant judgment about what's going on in the past is actually rooted in things that made sense for that time. Doesn't mean we need to bring those forward back into this time, but it does mean that context matters in how you see things. Now, I don't think that means that you should be necessarily following all these in your personal practices, but I think it's good to know because it creates context, and context is really helpful. At least I found that. Chapter 6, Greek magic. Now, of course, I wait till chapter 6 for this. But this is really focused on the magical practices of that time. However, I want to read another quote from a very delightful book. There's such a long list of resources, recommended readings. There's so many endnotes in this book. So there's plenty for you to dive into. But I start off this chapter with this quote. Magic is a difficult concept to identify in ancient Greece because there was no category exactly equivalent to our modern notion. It is likely that the use of what we might broadly describe as magical practices was widespread in all places and at all times, however. Although a number of Greek philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, as well as members of the medical profession, tended to equate magic with fraud, there was never any systematic persecution of its practitioners. So that is something to keep in mind, that magic was sort of held in a strange liminal place. And to this day, witchcraft is illegal in Greece. You will get talked to if you look like you're doing anything at an ancient site. There's ways to get around that, not that I know that. But this chapter really wants to speak to what magical practices did exist, even if they weren't sort of highlighted or they weren't always respected as much as they may be in places today or in other spaces. So this section starts off with talking about high and low magic, sort of the idea of like the high magic is that which connects to the gods, and the low magic is more of the not focused on the divine, but more focused on the everyday. So creating this strange little hierarchy, but also recognizing and showing that relationships with the divine were really important in this particular realm. And so there was a specific type of magic for that in which you invoke the gods, you praise them, you had these big celebrations. That was really important. And even if we can't say that it is something that was necessarily respected or easy to define, it was definitely a part of everyday life. And so I personally love a magic that is not just at certain times. I like a magic that is all the time. Also in this section, I talk about different forms of divination in ancient Greece. I talk about ways that prayers were done and continue to be done. I also talk about spells. And so I really lean in this book on the Greek magical papyri. So if you haven't seen that, highly recommend you take a look at that. Also sometimes called the PGM. That is just full of dedications to different gods, different very specific spell workings, and talks about different incense. Now there are places that are, sort of fragmented, but it's definitely worth a look. And I talk about it a little bit more in this book and in subsequent books, so stay tuned. Also, in this Greek magic section, I talk about curse tablets and amulets because those are delightful. It is amazing to see what people would curse each other for. It's very petty. It's almost, to me, and I can't go into this a lot in this book, but I want to just say this off the cuff. It's amazing to me to see what people would curse each other for. It reminds me a lot of people like saying things on social media to people they don't like and trying to, sort of stitch things with people and create like this bad reputation. Anyways, it's amazing. And so, highly recommend if you're interested to look into that because, unsurprisingly, the ancient Greece had some folks that are petty. If you look at the gods, they had some great examples of how to do that. And then the final chapter of the first section, or the first part, chapter 7, I call it Taking It Home because this is bringing it home. So, one of the things that I want to say is that I am not somebody who reconstructs ancient Greek practices. I'm definitely one who is inspired by them, and there are some things that I do stick to, but what I'm choosing to use may not be what you choose to use, may not be what was actually the thing, because we only know what we think we know. But in this section, I do talk about how to pray. And for me, this is about how to invoke gods, how to create sacred space, how to start a ritual. So this has been a bit of my format of how to do that. And I've definitely also changed it around to fit other practices that I do. But if you're interested in at least trying something, I do have it very clearly laid out. I also talk about how to create and set up your own temple space. I talk about modern offerings because, the offerings of ancient Greece relied a lot on animal sacrifice, and that's not what we do now. And so there are other ways to do this. Also, because I'm a big fan of this and I like to inspire folks and remind folks that this is also real places and real locations, I talk about modern sites of worship. So I talk about places in Athens. I talk about a whole bunch of different sacred sites that if you ever get the chance to visit, fantastic. And if you just research them, I'm sure there is some video of somebody walking around that site. Please look it up. It's very easy to find. So if you can't go, someone else has. But part 2. So we're talking about the Greek Pantheon. How about who's in the Pantheon? This is part 2 is where I get into that. This is the part of chapter 8 being gods and goddesses. And very important to note that I have definitely missed somebody in here. I'm sure I have. And it was more important for me to focus on the folks that you're probably going to run into in your practice. And if you find other folks, that's just even better. But I wanted to move through the timeline of the cosmology and the cosmogony. So we don't start with Zeus and Aphrodite and Apollo. We start with the primordial gods. And those are the gods, those are, Gaia and those more ethereal forces, that's air and wind and time and earth. And so all the building blocks of what was to come afterwards. And the primordial gods gave birth to their children, who are primarily the Titans. And so the Titans are those folks that, may or may not include Hecate, but includes Cronus and Hyperion and Oceanus and Thea and Phoebe and Rhea and Themis, et cetera, et cetera. And these folks were sort of like the next generation. They were not just, time. They were also time, but they are like coming into this mythology with a bit more information, definitely more human characteristics than the first round of primordials. And then these folks give birth to the Olympians. Now, I talk about many birth stories and how that is more complicated than I just summarized. However, what is important for you to know, I think, is that the Olympians decided they weren't the Olympians at first. They were just the kids. And they wanted to take over for their uh, parents. And so there was a war. And so the Olympians battled the Titans. And then the Olympians, obviously, won. And the Titans, most of them, got sent down to Tartarus, which is this mean, punishy place, but not the underworld. But I talk about all that because I think it's important to definitely bring forward how all these folks evolved. And you can see by the stories that I share, by how they're sort of arranged in the Pantheon, what they had to say about the world at that point, what they were trying to create in society in terms of what was right and what was wrong, and how they set up a hierarchy of morality, and but also didn't always follow the things that I think they were trying to set up. That's a lot to say. That's not a lot to say for a lot of gods. But there are chapter 9, I talk about other beings. So those are, there's so many more characters than the gods. There's spirits or daemons, there's nymphs, there's other creatures, there's giants, and there's also heroes that are human. And I talk a little bit about all of them. I bring in a lot of stories. I bring in a lot of quotes from sources, because I really think that, all of mythology is about storytelling, and it's about building relationships. And so I build relationships with humans, at least, by how I get to know them and by what I learn about them, by what stories we create together. So I think it's really important to prioritize that. So I did. I think almost every god has some story, or I tried to at least get as many as possible. I also brought in a lot of the Homeric and Orphic hymns so that folks can connect with different gods by how they've been praised. There's a lot of translations of that. Um, Also, I mean, before I say conclusion, which is what comes after this, after the conclusion, there is an appendix of terms. So, in case you're all new to this, I tried to define the key things. Also, there's recommended reading. Like I said before, lots of endnotes, my poor editor. And there's a huge bibliography because I had so many books helping me with this, so many websites, and I'm sure that there are more that I could have looked at, but I definitely wanted to, do my best to find and bring forward places that had really good information or thoughts or scholarship about ancient Greece and this mythology. And also wanted to cite my sources whenever I can. But I want to leave, before I ask if there's any questions, I'm going to leave with a little bit from the end of the book, because who doesn't like a good summary? I do. I'm not going to read all the conclusion because a lot of it is also invocation, probably not an invocation at the end, sort of a gratitude towards all the different gods that I talk about. So not all of them, but the big ones. But before that, I say this. While it might be unexpected to end a book about Greek mythology with the idea of skepticism, if these gods have taught me anything, it's to ask more questions. With each reading of a myth and each new book or resource I found, the gods became more complex, even if the facts were similar in tone and content. But isn't that the way humans are too? Though we might desire to be easy to see and understand, we aren't. We never will be. And that is a gift, to be alive and unfolding in each moment. Perhaps harder to know, but also wiser in the nuance of being perceived and interpreted. What lives on in myth lives on in life. So I walk in this world with a healthy dose of disbelief, the kind that allows me to stay curious, open, and willing to be proven wrong, to be proven unable to see things as beautiful as they truly are. But with the hope I will continue to look and look again, this is the magic for me, the magic of possibility and influence and evolution. I am really proud of this book, and I really think that it helps to inform the other books that I've written about the other gods. So if you want, I'm not going to say it's short, it is an efficient book of Greek mythology, but also a lot of details that I don't think are always covered. So I hope that it is helpful for you in the places and spaces that you are. And please reach out and know that I'm going to be doing a series of classes on the Pantheon too. So if you want even more, we can definitely do that together. But for now, I appreciate your time, your attention, and again, reach out to me at my website or social media if you want to connect. But I'll have some time here if there's any questions. And if not, enjoy the rest of your day. I'll just pose with my book for a second. Also, you should know it's very soft. And how many pages is it? So many. 191. Yeah, thank you. Ah, good to see you, Essa. Yeah, stay tuned, sign up for my Substack, things like that, and that will be where all the announcements are happening. I already have the graphics for them. I just need to figure out dates now. So. I think that is. Thanks so much.